Footsteps slapped the imported Italian marble harsh and utterly out of rhythm. Arthur did not want to walk away, but the two men flanking him made it impossible to stay. They wore cheap navy windbreakers over thick shoulders, smelling faintly of stale onion rings and aggressive drugstore aftershave. Uncle Richard stood by the grand staircase, meticulously smoothing the lapels of a wool suit that cost more than Arthur's entire net worth. "It's for the best," Arthur Richard said. His voice was smooth practiced, carrying the hollow resonance of a politician delivering bad news to a camera. Elias was unwell toward the end. "The estate is liquidating. The bank demands it, and frankly, you have no legal footing here. You've been squatting." Arthur wanted to punch him. He really did. He wanted to scream, to throw a heavy brass vase through the stained glass window, to enact some dramatic, righteous vengeance. Instead, he just felt a heavy, pathetic exhaustion pulling at his hamstrings. His stomach gurgled loudly, a mortifying sound in the cavernous foyer, reminding him he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. "He left me the house, Richard. You know he did. He told me on Tuesday." Arthur's voice cracked. It didn't sound commanding. It sounded whiny. He hated himself for it. Verbal promises from a man who spent his last days talking to pigeons mean nothing in probate court. Richard sighed, pulling a long, cylindrical leather tube from the console table. He extended it toward Arthur, as if handing a beggar a soiled dollar bill. "He did leave you this. Specifically. It was in the safe. The lawyers laughed, but it's yours. A piece of his legacy." Arthur didn't reach for it immediately. He stared at the leather tube. It was scuffed, cracked at the edges, and smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and damp earth, the distinct lingering scent of his grandfather Elias. For a brief, agonizing second, the smell bypassed Arthur's cynical defenses and clamped hard around his windpipe. He swallowed the lump, snatching the tube roughly from Richard's manicured fingers. The leather felt dry and fragile. "Get out!" Richard Arthur muttered, realizing too late how stupid it sounded to evict a man who was actively throwing him out. Richard offered a thin, bloodless smile. He nodded to the guards. A heavy hand clamped onto Arthur's shoulder fingers, digging painfully into his collarbone. They marched him down the long hallway past the oil paintings draped in plastic, past the dust motes dancing in the cold afternoon light. The heavy oak front door opened with a mechanical click and a groan of hinges. The guards shoved him lightly, not enough to knock him over, just enough to make him stumble down the first 2 stone steps. The heavy door slammed shut behind him. The lock engaged with a loud final clunk. Arthur stood on the expansive gravel driveway. The wind bit through his thin cotton jacket, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and rotting autumn leaves. He shivered, reaching into his pocket for a cigarette. He pulled out a crushed pack. One left bent perfectly in the middle. He straightened it, stuck it between his dry lips and flicked his plastic lighter. The flint sparked, catching the raw skin of his thumb. Nothing. He flicked it again. Again. A tiny flame sputtered and died before it could reach the tobacco. "Perfect," he whispered, tossing the useless lighter into the manicured azalea bushes. He looked down at the leather tube in his hand. It felt heavier now. Pop had been eccentric, sure. The man had made millions in mid-century real estate and spent his twilight years feeding stale bread to birds and refusing to use a telephone. But he wasn't stupid. Arthur twisted the brass cap of the tube. It squeaked metal, grinding on metal, fighting decades of friction. With a sharp tug, it popped off. Inside was a rolled piece of thick, heavy canvas parchment. Arthur pulled it out. A cloud of fine grey dust puffed into the air, making him cough violently. He unfurled it against the hood of his beat-up sedan parked at the edge of the property. It was a map. Not a treasure map with burnt edges and a red X, but a sprawling, meticulously hand-drawn surveyor's map of the city. Black ink faded to a dull charcoal mapped out grids, alleyways and avenues. The paper felt brittle under his fingertips, rough and textured like dried skin. At first glance, it was nothing but a useless relic. Arthur leaned closer, his chest pressing against the cold metal of his car. There were tiny, barely legible annotations scrawled in the margins in red ink. Pop's handwriting, frantic sharp angles. Lot 42, the anchor. Section 9, bleeding the line. Arthur traced a line across the grid with a dirty fingernail. The map covered the entire metropolitan area, but something was wrong with the scale. Certain blocks were drawn larger, exaggerated, while others were entirely missing left, as blank white voids. At the bottom right corner, a heavy wax seal had been pressed into the canvas. It was cracked, bearing the emblem of a key crossed with a fountain pen. Beneath it, a single line of text was typed in crisp black typewriter font, completely at odds with the hand-drawn nature of the rest of the document. To Arthur. They only see the bricks. You have to see the mortar. A cold drop of condensation rolled off an overhanging oak branch and hit the back of Arthur's neck, sending a sharp jolt down his spine. He wiped it away, smearing a line of dirt across his collar. He looked back at the imposing stone facade of the mansion. The lights were already off in Pop's study. Richard was already erasing them. Arthur carefully rolled the stiff canvas back up the sound of the thick paper scraping against itself, strangely loud in the quiet driveway. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have money and he didn't have a home. But his stomach had stopped rumbling. Coffee at Benny's always tasted like burnt copper and regret, but it cost $1.50, and the waitresses didn't care if you sat in the back booth for 3 hours. Arthur slid into the cracked red vinyl seat. The material sighed under his weight, exhaling the stale scent of old fryer grease and industrial bleach. The fluorescent light above him flickered with a persistent low-grade hum that drilled directly into his temples. He ordered a black coffee from a waitress named Shirley, whose name tag was holding on for dear life. When she set the thick, chipped ceramic mug, down a bit of the dark liquid sloshed over the rim, pooling on the scratched formica table. Arthur didn't wipe it up. He just watched it spread for a moment before pushing the mug aside to make room. He unrolled the map. The canvas flattened out with a stubborn stiffness, the corners curling upward. He weighed them down with the salt shaker, the pepper shaker, his dead cell phone, and the coffee mug. In the harsh diner lighting, the faded red ink annotations seemed to pulse slightly against the charcoal lines. They only see the bricks. You have to see the mortar. Arthur rubbed his eyes, the gritty feeling of sleep deprivation making him wince. He needed to think. Elias wasn't prone to riddles for the sake of entertainment. If the old man left him a map, it wasn't a sentimental gesture. Elias viewed sentimentality as a weakness right up there with using margarine instead of butter. Arthur's finger drifted to the center of the map. The financial district. A cluster of dense, towering buildings. But on Elias's map, one specific block was shaded in heavily, with a crosshatch pattern. Arthur recognized the intersection 5th and Main. It was the site of the old Mercantile Exchange building, a massive, brutalist concrete structure that had been boarded up since the late 90s. The city had tried to tear it down twice, but tied-up zoning litigation always stalled the bulldozers. Next to the crosshatched block, Elias had written a tiny sequence of numbers, 492881C. It wasn't a phone number, too short, not a combination lock. Arthur pulled out his wallet and thumbed through his meager collection of cards. A maxed-out credit card. A gym membership he hadn't used in 3 years. His driver's license. Then tucked behind a faded receipt, a small laminated business card Pop had given him years ago, telling him to keep it for when the wolves come. Arthur pulled it out. It was completely blank, except for an address on 5th and Main and a name Sullivan. Arthur threw 2 crumpled dollar bills onto the table. He grabbed the map, rolling it hastily, uncaring, as a slight tear formed at the edge. The sound of the ripping canvas made his breath catch a brief spike of panic, but he shoved it back into the leather tube. The walk to the financial district took 40 minutes. The biting autumn wind whipped down the concrete canyons, carrying the metallic smells of exhaust fumes and city grime. Arthur's thin jacket did nothing to stop the cold from settling deep into his bones. His feet ached in his worn-out boots, the rubber soles worn thin on the heels. He felt small here, walking past towering glass facades, where men like his Uncle Richard sat in heated boardrooms, dismantling his grandfather's life piece by piece. He arrived at 5th and Main. The old mercantile building was uglier in person. A monolith of stained grey concrete covered in decades of soot and peeling warnings about trespassers. The ground floor windows were bricked up. It looked dead. Arthur circled the building, the leather tube tight in his grip. On the alley side, hidden behind a dumpster overflowing with soggy cardboard, he found a heavy steel service door. It was rusted, the paint flaking off in large, rusty scabs. There was no handle, just a heavy keyhole and a small, dull brass intercom panel next to it. Arthur pressed the button. It felt stuck, resisting his thumb before finally depressing with a sad crunch. Nothing happened. No ring. No static. Just the distant sound of traffic. "Stupid," Arthur muttered aloud, kicking the bottom of the steel door. The impact sent a sharp jolt of pain up his leg. He leaned his forehead against the cold metal, closing his eyes. "You're chasing ghosts, Artie. You're homeless, and you're chasing ghosts." Click. The sound was sharp, mechanical, echoing from deep within the steel door. Arthur stepped back, his heart kicking against his ribs in a sudden frantic rhythm. The heavy door groaned, the hinges screaming in protest as it popped open just an inch, releasing a draft of dry, warm air that smelled distinctly of ozone and old paper. Arthur swallowed hard. He pushed the door open the rest of the way and stepped inside. He expected a derelict lobby filled with trash and rats. Instead, the heavy door slammed shut behind him, plunging him into darkness for only a split second before motion sensors clicked overhead. Row upon row of warm amber lights flickered to life, illuminating a pristine, massive hallway lined with polished mahogany doors. The floors were spotless terrazzo. The air was climate-controlled and perfectly still. At the end of the hall sat a heavy oak desk. Behind it sat a man who looked older than the building itself. He wore a crisp, tailored suit from another era, his thin white hair slicked back. He was carefully cleaning a pair of wire-rimmed glasses with a silk cloth. The man looked up, his pale blue eyes locking onto Arthur. He didn't look surprised. He looked at the leather tube in Arthur's hand, then back to his face. "You're late," the old man said, his voice like dry leaves scraping across a driveway. "Elias said you'd be here by noon." Arthur stood frozen, the warmth of the building finally thawing his numb fingers. "Who are you?" "I'm Sullivan," the man said, sliding his glasses onto his nose. He opened a massive ledger on his desk. "And you, Arthur, have a lot of paperwork to sign, assuming you still have the map, and assuming you're ready to take possession." "Possession of what?" Arthur's voice barely squeaked out. "This building." Sullivan let out a dry, humorless chuckle. It sounded like a cough. He closed the ledger and tapped the cover. "This building, no, Arthur. This building is just the filing cabinet." Sullivan pointed a bony finger toward the leather tube. "The map you're holding isn't a list of properties. It's the master deed to the underlying infrastructure. The dirt, the power grid leases, the water rights." Sullivan leaned forward, the smell of peppermint and old age drifting toward Arthur. "Your grandfather didn't leave you a house, son. He left you the city." Coughing, a dry, rattling sound, escaped Arthur's throat before he could stop it. The sheer absurdity of the statement hung in the stagnant, climate-controlled air of the subterranean office. He looked from the ancient man behind the desk to the scuffed leather tube in his own hands, waiting for the punchline. But Sullivan's face remained a mask of papery wrinkles, devoid of humour or warmth. "The city." Arthur repeated the words, tasting like ash. "You mean he owned a lot of real estate, apartment buildings, commercial blocks?" "No, Arthur." Sullivan pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling a long, slow breath that smelled faintly of peppermint and decaying paper. "Your Uncle Richard owns the buildings. He and the board took the shiny things, the glass, the steel, the penthouses. They fought over the superficial skyline like dogs fighting over a bone. Elias let them have it. Sullivan stood up. His joints popped loudly in the quiet room. He walked past Arthur, his gait slow but meticulously balanced, and approached a massive wall of dark green metal filing cabinets. He pulled a drawer open. The ball bearings screamed against the runners. He extracted a thick manila folder, the edges frayed and soft like felt, and dropped it onto the mahogany desk. Dust plumed upward, dancing in the amber light. Elias understood something very fundamental about modern civilization, Sullivan said, tapping the folder with a yellowed fingernail. Buildings crumble, corporations go bankrupt, people move, but they always need water, they always need electricity, they always need to cross from one side of the river to the other. Arthur stepped closer to the desk. His boots left faint damp outlines on the polished terrazzo floor. The cold from outside was finally leaving his muscles, replaced by a creeping nervous sweat. He stared at the folder. In the late 70s, Sullivan continued, his voice dropping into a dry, rhythmic cadence of a man reciting history he had lived through. This city was broke, bankrupt. The municipal government was selling off assets just to keep the garbage trucks running. Elias didn't buy the skyscrapers. He bought the dirt underneath them. He bought the 99-year leases on the utility corridors. He bought the bedrock rights where the subway extensions were planned. Sullivan opened the folder. Inside were carbon copies of contracts, the blue ink fading the paper brittle and translucent. Every foot of fiber optic cable laid downtown pays a micro toll to an holding company Elias established. Sullivan said, turning the pages carefully. The water mains servicing the financial district. They run through a subterranean easement that your grandfather owns outright. The air rights above the transit hubs. The foundational leases for the bridges. Arthur's stomach gave a sharp, painful twist. It wasn't hunger anymore. It was a deep, visceral vertigo. The ground beneath his feet suddenly felt conceptual, precarious. He gripped the edge of Sullivan's desk. The wood was cold and unyielding. "Richard doesn't know," Arthur whispered. It wasn't a question. "Richard is an idiot," Sullivan stated plainly, without an ounce of malice, just stating a geological fact. Richard sees the rent checks from the tenants. He doesn't see the toll the building pays to the earth it sits on. Elias buried these assets beneath dozens of shell companies, blind trusts, and offshore entities. It's a labyrinth of paper. But this map... Sullivan pointed a bony finger at the leather tube Arthur still clutched. "Is the Rosetta Stone. It correlates the holding companies to the physical coordinates." "Why me?" Arthur's voice cracked. He sounded pathetic weak. He hated it. "I haven't spoken to him in 2 years. I've been living in his guest house, drinking cheap beer and failing to hold down a job at a hardware store. Why didn't he give this to someone who knows what they're doing?" Sullivan looked at Arthur, really looked at him. The old man's pale blue eyes traced the bags under Arthur's eyes, the cheap, poorly fitting jacket, the trembling in his fingers. "Because you're angry, Arthur," Sullivan said softly. Elias said the others were too comfortable. Comfort makes men blind. You, on the other hand, have nothing left to lose. And you know what it feels like to be chewed up by people like Richard. Elias didn't want a businessman. He wanted a ghost, someone who could operate in the dark. Sullivan reached into his breast pocket and produced a heavy black fountain pen. It looked expensive, dangerous. He slid a fresh, crisp sheet of paper across the desk. It was covered in dense, microscopic legal text. At the bottom was a single line for a signature. "The transition of the master trust requires your signature witnessed by the executor." "That is me," Sullivan said. He uncapped the pen. The nib gleamed under the overhead lights. "If you sign this, you inherit the underlying structure of a metropolis. You will have access to capital that Richard cannot even fathom, but you will also inherit Elias's enemies, the city council, the utility monopolies, men who have spent decades trying to find out who really owns the ground they walk on." Arthur stared at the pen. His hand was shaking violently now. He felt sick. The smell of ozone and old paper was suffocating. He thought of Richard standing in the foyer, smoothing his expensive suit, tossing him out like a piece of broken furniture. He thought of the cold driveway. He thought of the dead lighter in the bushes. He reached out and took the pen. The metal was heavy, perfectly balanced. The ink flowed thick and black onto the paper as he scrawled his name. It was an ugly, frantic signature. It didn't look like the mark of a billionaire. It looked like a desperate man clawing his way out of a grave. Sullivan nodded, taking the paper and slipping it into a leather portfolio. "It is done." "So," Arthur swallowed his throat sandpaper dry. "What do I do now? Where's the money?" Sullivan offered that dry, rattling chuckle again. "The money is tied up in escrow accounts that take 72 hours to clear the transfer protocols. Until then, you are exactly as broke as you were 10 minutes ago." Sullivan reached into his desk and pulled out a heavy brass key attached to a ring with a small plastic tag. He slid it across the desk. "Go to the address on the tag. It's a maintenance substation under the old railway bridge. Elias kept a bed there, and canned food. Get out of sight. Tomorrow we start tearing Richard's empire down from the roots." Neon bled into the puddles on the cracked asphalt, turning the dirty rainwater into pools of toxic pink and sickly green. Arthur stood on the corner of 5th and Main, the heavy steel door of the mercantile building locked solidly behind him. The wind had picked up, slicing right through the thin cotton of his jacket, but he barely felt the chill. A frantic, chaotic energy vibrated just beneath his skin, making his teeth chatter in a rhythm entirely detached from the cold. He looked down at his boots. Beneath the worn rubber soles, beneath the concrete sidewalk, beneath the layers of packed dirt and gravel, lay a labyrinth of high-voltage lines, fiber optic bundles, and pressurized water mains. And he owned the rights to all of it. The thought was too massive to hold in his head at once. It felt like trying to swallow the ocean. A sleek black town car hissed past him, its tires throwing a fine mist of dirty water against Arthur's shins. He flinched instinctively, stepping back into the shadows of the bricked-up facade. A man in the back seat of the car was talking on his phone, his face illuminated by the harsh blue glow of a tablet. It could have been Richard. It could have been one of Richard's lawyers. Arthur's hand drifted to his pocket, his fingers curling tightly around the heavy brass key Sullivan had given him. The metal was cold grounding. He had a kingdom of dirt and wires, but his stomach gave a violent hollow cramp, reminding him aggressively of his fragile biology. He needed a safe place. He needed to sit down before his knees gave out. The plastic tag on the keyring had a faded address scrawled in Sharpie Substation 4, Lower Riverside. He started walking. The journey took him away from the financial district, away from the towering glass monoliths, and down toward the industrial arteries of the city. The air changed here. The smell of expensive cologne and exhaust fumes faded, replaced by the thick metallic tang of the river and the sour stench of wet garbage. Streetlights flickered, casting long wavering shadows across the empty loading docks and rusted chain-link fences. Arthur's legs felt like lead. Every step sent a dull ache shooting up his shins. He passed a group of men huddled around a burning trash can under an overpass. A few days ago, he would have crossed the street to avoid them. Tonight, he looked at the ground they were standing on, realizing with a bitter, cynical irony that they were trespassing on his property. He didn't feel superior. He just felt incredibly, deeply tired. Lower Riverside was a graveyard of brick warehouses and rotting wooden piers. He found Substation 4 tucked beneath the heavy steel pylons of the old railway bridge. It was a squat concrete bunker, barely visible behind a wall of overgrown dead blackberry brambles. The heavy iron door was painted a dull industrial grey, peeling in large flaky scabs. Arthur pushed through the thorny bushes, ignoring the scratches on his hands. He jammed the brass key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. He jiggled it, forcing it, cursing under his breath. The mechanism ground against decades of rust and grime before finally yielding with a heavy, satisfying clack. He threw his shoulder against the iron door. It scraped open, pushing against a layer of debris on the floor inside. Arthur stepped into the dark. He fumbled along the concrete wall until his fingers brushed a heavy industrial switch. He threw it. Fluorescent tubes flickered overhead, buzzing like an angry hornet's nest, before flooding the room with harsh blue-white light. It wasn't just a maintenance room. It was a bunker. The air was stale, smelling of ozone dust and old coffee. Against the far wall sat an old military surplus cot with a scratchy wool blanket. But it was the rest of the room that made Arthur's breath catch in his throat. Banks of outdated computer monitors sat on cheap folding tables, their screens dark. Corkboards covered the concrete walls, layered thickly with maps, photographs, and legal documents pinned together with red string. It looked like the bedroom of a conspiracy theorist. Arthur walked closer, his boots crunching on stray paperclips and grit. He recognized faces on the board: city councilmen, zoning commissioners, corporate executives. And right in the center, a large candid photograph of Uncle Richard walking out of a high-end restaurant, smiling broadly. Across Richard's face, Elias had written a single word in thick black marker: parasite. Below the corkboards were stacks of cardboard boxes. Arthur knelt down, tearing the tape off the nearest one. It was full of canned soup, bottled water, and a camping stove. Next to it was a smaller, heavy metal lockbox. Arthur's hands shook as he opened a can of beef stew. He didn't bother heating it. He found a plastic spoon on a desk and shoveled the cold, congealed mass into his mouth. It tasted like tin and salt, but it was the best thing he had ever eaten. He sat on the edge of the cot, the cheap springs groaning under his weight, chewing mechanically. He looked around the room. This was Elias's true legacy. Not the mansion, not the expensive suits. This paranoid subterranean existence. Elias had spent his life playing a massive invisible game of chess, hoarding the very veins of the city, trusting no one. And now he had dumped the board into Arthur's lap. Arthur finished the soup, dropping the empty can onto the floor. It rolled away, the metallic clatter echoing off the concrete walls. He laid back on the cot, pulling the rough wool blanket over his shivering shoulders. He was the richest man in the city, sleeping in a concrete box, eating cold soup in the dark. The contradiction bubbled up in his chest, escaping his mouth as a short, breathless laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It sounded exactly like Elias. He closed his eyes, listening to the heavy rumble of a freight train crossing the bridge overhead. It didn't sound like noise anymore. It sounded like a heartbeat. His heartbeat. He would sleep tonight. Tomorrow, the city was going to bleed. Sunlight never reached substation 4. Arthur woke to the aggressive mechanical buzz of the fluorescent tubes overhead and a stiffness in his neck that radiated down into his shoulder blades. The military cot offered no support, only a sagging canvas trench. He sat up, rubbing his face with dirty hands. His skin felt greasy, coated in a fine layer of subterranean grit. He was 32 years old, technically a billionaire, and he desperately needed a shower. He kicked the empty soup can across the concrete floor. It clattered against the leg of a folding table, jarring a thick leather-bound ledger from the edge. It hit the ground with a heavy thud, a cloud of dust puffing outward. Arthur knelt, his knees popping, and picked it up. The cover was unmarked. He opened it, expecting more legal jargon or bank routing numbers. Instead, it was a manual. Elias hadn't just hoarded paper deeds. He had mapped the physical architecture of his control. Pages were filled with precise hand-drawn schematics of valves, breaker boxes, and junction relays. Beside each drawing were notes in his grandfather's tight, manic script. Sector 4, main aquifer bypass, needs grease, requires key 7. Arthur walked over to the corkboard, his eyes scanning the red string radiating from his Uncle Richard's smiling photograph. One string pinned directly to a glossy magazine cutout of a skyscraper currently under construction. The Osprey, Richard's crown jewel. A 90-story luxury high-rise, slated to open its first phase of residential leasing on Monday. It was Richard's vanity project, heavily leveraged, built on the promise of high-end amenities and uninterrupted river views. Elias had circled the address in black marker. Below it, a page number was written, page 114. Arthur flipped the ledger to page 114. It detailed a high-pressure municipal water main junction located directly beneath the financial district grid, feeding the blocks surrounding the Osprey. Comfort makes men blind. Arthur whispered, his voice raspy in the dead air of the bunker. He looked down at the key ring Sullivan had given him. Dozens of heavy brass, irregularly shaped keys hung from the metal loop. He spent 20 minutes searching the bunker before he found what he needed. A heavy canvas tool bag containing a rusted pipe wrench, a can of industrial lubricant, and a heavy-duty flashlight. He slung the strap over his shoulder. It dug painfully into his collarbone. At the back of the bunker, behind a row of empty filing cabinets, sat a heavy steel grate set into the floor. Arthur hooked his fingers through the iron lattice. He pulled. It didn't budge. Grunting, planting his boots firmly on the concrete, he hauled upward with his legs. The hinges shrieked a sound like tearing metal, and the grate slammed open, revealing a vertical concrete shaft dropping into absolute darkness. A rusted iron ladder bolted to the wall descended into the abyss. The air rising from the hole smelled of sulphur-wet rot and ancient stagnant water. Arthur turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating damp brickwork and thick black cables, entirely coated in slime. He climbed down. His boots slipped on the wet iron rungs, his heart spiking with adrenaline every time his foot failed to find immediate purchase. The descent felt endless. The temperature dropped sharply, the damp cold sinking through his thin jacket and into his marrow. At the bottom, he stepped into a utility corridor, barely tall enough for him to stand upright. It was a tunnel built for pipes, not people. A massive cast-iron water main ran the length of the ceiling, weeping condensation. He walked for what felt like an hour, navigating by the schematics in the ledger. The tunnel branched, twisted, and dipped. The only sound was the hollow slap of his boots in the shallow puddles, and the distant rhythmic thrum of the city's heart subway trains vibrating through the bedrock. He found the junction. It was a cavernous, brick-lined chamber dominated by a massive rusted wheel valve attached to a pipe the size of a small car. A heavy chain wrapped around the spokes of the wheel locked with a thick brass padlock. Arthur checked the brass keys on his ring. He tried 3 before one slid into the padlock. It turned smoothly. The chain fell away, hitting the flooded floor with a heavy splash. He grabbed the iron wheel. The metal was freezing and rough with rust. He pushed. Nothing. He threw his entire body weight against it, his boots slipping in the mud. The wheel held fast. Panic, hot and embarrassing, flared in his chest. He was going to fail down here wrestling a piece of iron. He grabbed the can of lubricant from the bag, spraying a thick, chemical-smelling foam onto the spindle. He waited 30 seconds, his breath pluming in the cold air. He wrapped his hands around the wheel again, planting his feet wide. He closed his eyes, thinking of Richard smoothing his expensive suit in the foyer, thinking of the cold, gravel driveway. With a guttural yell, Arthur hauled downward. The iron groaned. A sharp, metallic pop echoed through the chamber, and the wheel gave a 1/4 inch. Arthur gasped for air, adjusting his grip, and pulled again. A half turn, then a full turn. The resistance broke. As he spun, the wheel closed. A deep, shuddering vibration travelled through the floorboards. The rushing sound of millions of gallons of pressurized water suddenly choked, starved of its path. The pipe above him banged loudly, protesting the sudden change in pressure. Arthur leaned against the cold iron of the valve chest, heaving his hands raw and scraped. He had just severed the main water feed to 4 city blocks. Dust coated the back of Arthur's throat, tasting like powdered chalk and old copper. He emerged from a heavy iron access door tucked behind a row of dumpsters in an alleyway 2 blocks from Osprey Tower. The midday sun was blinding. He squinted, holding a hand up to shield his eyes as the chaotic symphony of surface traffic washed over him. He looked down at his clothes. His jeans were soaked to the knees with foul-smelling subterranean water, and his knuckles were bleeding sluggishly. He looked like a vagrant. He felt like a god. Arthur walked out of the alley and merged with the fast-paced flow of pedestrians on the sidewalk. Nobody looked at him. To them, he was just another piece of urban blight to step around. He kept his head down walking until he reached a high-end coffee shop with floor-to-ceiling windows positioned directly across the avenue from Richard's construction site. He found a crumpled $10 bill in the lining of his jacket, a forgotten remnant from a previous easier life. He bought a black coffee, enduring the barista's thinly veiled look of disgust, and took a seat at the window counter. Osprey Tower was a magnificent spear of blue glass and dark steel. It was also currently a disaster zone. Dozens of construction workers in neon vests were milling around the base of the tower, smoking cigarettes and looking confused. A fleet of plumbing trucks with flashing amber lights was parked haphazardly along the curb. Foremen were shouting into radios, gesturing wildly at the ground. Then the sleek black town car arrived. It pulled up onto the sidewalk, completely disregarding the pedestrian right-of-way. The rear door flew open before the car even fully stopped. Uncle Richard stepped out. He wasn't wearing his usual perfectly tailored jacket. His tie was loosened, his face flushed an ugly mottled red. Even through the thick glass of the coffee shop, Arthur could practically feel the man's panic. Richard grabbed a foreman by the shoulder, demanding answers. The foreman just shook his head, pointing vaguely at the street. Without water pressure, the concrete mixers couldn't operate. The high-level fire suppression tests required for the Monday inspection couldn't be run. The entire site was paralyzed. Arthur sipped his coffee. It burned his tongue, bitter and wonderful. He watched Richard pull a cell phone from his pocket, his thumb jabbing angrily at the screen. Arthur's hand drifted to his own pocket. Earlier, when he had climbed back up into the bunker to drop off the tool bag, he had found a small padded envelope pushed under the heavy iron door. Inside was a cheap plastic burner phone already charged and a bundle of $50 bills secured with a rubber band. Sullivan was ensuring his new employer didn't starve before the escrow cleared. Arthur pulled the plastic phone out. He punched in the direct line for Richard's private office. He had memorized it off the corkboard. He watched through the window as Richard's personal phone buzzed. Richard looked at the screen, frowned at the unknown number, and answered. "Richard," Arthur said. His voice was calm, shockingly steady. It didn't sound like the broken man from the driveway. Across the street, Richard froze. He pressed the phone tighter to his ear. "Arthur, how did you get this number? Listen to me, you little parasite. I don't have time for your begging today. I have a crisis." "I know," Arthur replied, taking another slow sip of his coffee. "Concrete doesn't set very well dry, does it?" There was a long, heavy silence on the line. Through the glass, Arthur watched the colour completely drain from his uncle's face, leaving it a waxy pale grey. Richard slowly lowered his hand, looking frantically around the crowded street, scanning the faces of the pedestrians. "What did you do?" Richard's voice was barely a whisper now, all the arrogant bluster stripped away. "Pop didn't leave me the house, Richard," Arthur said, resting his elbow on the counter. "He let you keep the bricks. They look very nice, but you forgot who owns the pipes. You forgot who owns the dirt. You're insane. You don't own anything. The estate is a shell game," Arthur interrupted smoothly. "And I'm holding the only map. You have until midnight to vacate the mansion. Leave the keys on the console table. If you aren't gone, I'll shut down the power grid to the entire financial district. Let's see how your board of directors feels about losing millions a minute because you pissed off the landlord." "You can't do that," Richard breathed. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. "I already turned off your water, Richard, with my bare hands." Arthur let a short, harsh laugh escape his lips. "Don't test me. I don't have anything to lose. You have everything to lose." He ended the call, snapping the cheap plastic phone in half and tossing it into the trash can beside the counter. Arthur stood up, leaving the half-finished coffee. He walked out onto the street, the cold autumn wind hitting his face. He didn't look back at Osprey Tower or his uncle. He didn't need to. He reached into his pocket, his fingers tracing the heavy brass teeth of his keys. He had a city to run, and he was already late for his next appointment. Subway trains always smelled like burning hair and hot pennies. Arthur rode the Sea Line out to the industrial district, gripping the overhead metal bar. His knuckles were wrapped in cheap drugstore gauze he'd bought with Sullivan's cash, the stark white fabric already stained with a faint rim of dried blood. Every jolt of the train sent a dull throb up his forearm, a physical reminder that his newfound power didn't make him bulletproof. It just made him a target. Sullivan's text message had been brief: terminal station. Platform 4. Bring the ledger. He exited the train at the end of the line. The station was deserted, a sprawling cavern of cracked yellow tiles and flickering fluorescent bulbs buzzing like dying insects. At the far end of the platform, past the yellow caution paint, a heavy steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" stood propped open by a rusted brick. Arthur stepped over the brick, plunging into a dimly lit maintenance corridor. The temperature spiked immediately, the air thick and heavy, with the smell of ozone hot grease and massive electrical currents. A low, vibrating hum rattled the fillings in his teeth. He emerged onto a grated metal catwalk, suspended 50 feet above a sprawling turbine floor. Below him, massive grey generators, the size of houses, spun with terrifying, deafening power. This was the central artery of the city's power grid. Sullivan was waiting on the catwalk. Beside the old man stood someone entirely out of place, a man in a bespoke charcoal suit, holding a leather briefcase against his chest like a shield. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, but his face was slick with a thin layer of terrified sweat. Arthur. Sullivan shouted over the roar of the turbines, his dry voice slicing through the noise. Meet Thomas. He sits on the Municipal Energy Board. He also manages the political action committee that funded your uncle's latest zoning variances. Thomas didn't offer his hand. He looked at Arthur's damp jeans, his cheap, filthy jacket, and the crude gauze on his hands. Disgust and confusion warred openly on the man's face. This is a joke, Thomas barked, looking at Sullivan. You bring me to a subterranean sweatbox to meet a vagrant. Richard warned me you were pulling some kind of stunt with Elias's will, but this is pathetic. Arthur felt his face flush. The old familiar shame crept up his neck. A day ago, a man like Thomas would have had him arrested just for standing too close. Arthur looked down at his boots, feeling the vibration of the catwalk rattle through his soles. He traced the feeling downward through the metal, down into the concrete pillars, down into the bedrock. He owned the bedrock. Arthur unslung the canvas tool bag from his shoulder. He dropped it onto the metal grating with a heavy metallic clang that managed to cut through the ambient roar. He reached in and pulled out the leather-bound ledger. Page 62, Arthur said. His voice wavered for a fraction of a second before hardening into something flat and cold. He opened the book, flipping the thick, rough pages until he found the schematic. He shoved the open book against Thomas's chest. The man flinched instinctively, grabbing the ledger to keep it from falling over the railing. Look at it, Arthur commanded. Thomas blinked rapidly, adjusting his expensive glasses. His eyes darted over the intricate hand-drawn schematics. This facility, Arthur pointed down at the spinning generators, sits on a 99-year land lease, a lease held by a shell corporation called Apex Holdings. Apex Holdings is wholly owned by the Elias Master Trust. I am the sole executor. Arthur stepped closer. The smell of Thomas's expensive sandalwood cologne mixed sickeningly with the industrial grease in the air. I don't care about your political action committee, Thomas. I don't care about Richard. What I care about is that Section 4 of that lease explicitly states that structural modifications to the foundation require the landlord's written approval. Arthur tapped the page roughly. You installed those 2 new substations last year to handle the load for Osprey Tower. You bolted them directly into my bedrock without asking. Thomas swallowed audibly. That's a minor administrative oversight. We can settle the retroactive permits. I don't want permits, Arthur interrupted, his heart hammering against his ribs. It felt unnatural bullying a man in a suit, but the adrenaline tasted like copper on his tongue. I'm terminating the lease. Breach of contract. You have 24 hours to remove your generators from my property before I have the structural pillars condemned. You can't be serious, Thomas yelled, dropping his briefcase. It hit the catwalk, popping open, spilling glossy reports across the metal grating. You'd plunge half the city into darkness. The hospitals, the traffic grids, you're talking about terrorism. I'm talking about eviction. Arthur corrected him, staring dead into the man's panicked eyes. Unless. Thomas froze, hanging on the word. Unless what? Unless you freeze all utility lines to Richard's properties. All of them. The residential high-rises. The commercial parks. I want the meters ripped out by tomorrow morning. Thomas looked at Sullivan, pleading silently for intervention, but the old man just watched the exchange with the impassive gaze of a reptile. Thomas looked back at Arthur, at the bloody gauze, the wild, exhausted eyes. He realized he wasn't dealing with a businessman. He was dealing with a man who had absolutely nothing to lose. Okay, Thomas whispered, the fight completely draining out of his shoulders. Okay, it's done. Arthur snatched the ledger back. He didn't feel triumphant. As he turned and walked back toward the dark maintenance tunnel, his knees shook so violently he had to drag his hand along the brick wall just to stay upright. Midnight arrived without fanfare, carrying only the biting chill of the autumn wind. Arthur walked up the long, sweeping driveway of the estate. The gravel crunched loudly beneath his worn boots, the exact same sound it had made yesterday when the guards had shoved him out the front door. It felt like a lifetime ago. It felt like a hallucination. The massive stone facade of the mansion loomed against the night sky, completely dark. Not a single light burned in the windows. Arthur stopped at the base of the stone steps. His breath plumed in the cold air. His muscles ached with a deep lactic burn, and his stomach was an empty, gnawing cavity. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cheap plastic lighter. He flicked it. Once. Twice. On the third try, a weak, sputtering orange flame illuminated the darkness. He stared at it for a second, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his cracked lips before clicking it shut and shoving it away. He climbed the steps. The heavy oak door was unlocked. Arthur pushed it open. The hinges groaned softly in the cavernous silence of the foyer. The air inside smelled of lemon polish, old wood, and the faint, lingering trace of Richard's aggressive drugstore aftershave. But Richard was gone. On the polished mahogany console table, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the stained glass window, sat a silver tray. Resting in the center of the tray was a heavy ring of brass keys. Arthur picked them up. The metal was cold. He stood in the massive echoing hallway, waiting for the surge of vindication. He waited for the triumphant rush of victory. He had broken his uncle. He had reclaimed his grandfather's house. He was the undisputed master of the board. Nothing came. Instead, a crushing, suffocating exhaustion dropped onto his shoulders. He felt like a hollow shell of a man standing in a museum. He dropped the keys back onto the silver tray. The loud clatter made him flinch. He didn't turn on the lights. He walked blindly through the dark corridors, his hand trailing along the plastic-draped oil paintings, navigating purely by memory. He walked past the grand dining room, past the sprawling kitchen, and pushed open the heavy double doors to Elias's study. The room smelled intensely of pipe tobacco and damp earth. Arthur's chest tightened, a sharp, sudden grief, finally piercing through the armor of adrenaline he'd been wearing all day. He stumbled toward the heavy leather armchair behind the massive desk and collapsed into it. The leather sighed under his weight. He closed his eyes, resting his throbbing head against the high back of the chair. He was so tired. He just wanted to sleep. His hand brushed against something hard on the desk. He opened his eyes. Sitting precisely in the center of the leather blotter was a small, square wooden box. It hadn't been there yesterday. Arthur sat forward, his joints popping. He reached out and undid the small brass clasp. Inside the box sat a single glass vial filled with black ink and a fountain pen identical to the one Sullivan had used. Beneath the pen was a small folded piece of thick canvas parchment. Arthur unfolded it. It was a letter written in Elias's sharp, frantic handwriting. Arthur, if you are reading this, you have the house back. You have likely broken Richard. You have felt the power of the mortar, but you also feel the emptiness of it. Revenge is a fast-burning fuel. It gets you out of the dirt, but it cannot sustain you. I didn't give you the city so you could punish the people I hated. I gave it to you because the city is dying. The pipes are rusting. The grid is overloading. The foundation is cracking. The men in the glass towers are bleeding it dry, taking the profits and ignoring the rot beneath their feet. I was too old. I became a dragon sitting on a hoard, hoarding the keys out of paranoia. You are young. You have seen what it looks like from the gutter. Look at the back of the map. Arthur scrambled to his feet. He grabbed the scuffed leather tube he had leaned against the wall. He pulled out the master map, unfurling the stiff canvas across the desk. He flipped it over. The back of the canvas wasn't blank. It was covered in blue ink. Where the front of the map showed the leverage points, the chokeholds, the weapons, the back of the map showed the decay. Thousands of tiny blue annotations marked failing water mains, collapsing subway tunnels, and overloaded electrical relays. It was a triage chart. The red ink is how you survive, the letter concluded. The blue ink is how you lead. You are not just the landlord, Arthur. You are the warden. Fix it. Arthur stared at the sprawling blue web of decay. His hands stopped shaking. The bitter, cynical anger that had driven him for the past 48 hours slowly evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, immense sense of purpose. He picked up the heavy fountain pen from the box. He uncapped it. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have a staff. He just had a map, bleeding knuckles, and a city that was quietly tearing itself apart in the dark. Arthur pulled the desk lamp closer, switched it on, and leaned over the map. It was time to go to work. Cold coffee tasted like battery acid, but Arthur swallowed it anyway, wincing as it hit his empty stomach and sent a sharp, acidic cramp through his ribs. The brass desk lamp in Elias's study threw a harsh yellow circle over the stiff canvas map. It was 4 a.m. His knuckles throbbed in time with his heartbeat, the cheap drugstore gauze crusted with stiff, dried blood, but he couldn't stop tracing the intricate blue ink lines his grandfather had drawn. Every tiny mark was a fracture, a rusted expansion joint, a stressed suspension cable, a failing high-voltage relay. The city was a dying patient, and Elias had left him the triage chart. Arthur grabbed the scuffed leather tube, the heavy ring of brass keys, and the ledger. He didn't bother finding clean clothes. The damp, foul-smelling denim and dirt-caked boots were his uniform now. He met Sullivan down in Substation 4. The old man was already awake, hunched over a hot plate, brewing something that smelled aggressively like burnt chicory and diesel exhaust. "You look terrible, Arthur," Sullivan observed mildly, pouring a dark, sluggish liquid into a chipped mug. "The transit hub at 8th and Commerce," Arthur said, ignoring the mug and unrolling the map forcefully over the folding table. He tapped a cluster of dense blue annotations right in the center of the grid. "The structural pylons. The ink here is heavily underlined. 3 times. What does it mean?" Sullivan leaned in, his pale eyes narrowing. He turned, pulled a thick, redacted file from a green cabinet, and tossed it onto the map. "The 8th Street hub sits on reclaimed marshland," Sullivan stated, his voice carrying the dry detachment of a historian. "The city was legally mandated to reinforce the bedrock anchors a decade ago. They diverted the budget to build a new sports arena. If those lateral pylons give way, the entire commuter concourse collapses into the subterranean water table." Arthur felt a freezing sweat break across his forehead, chilling the back of his neck. Thousands walked through that concourse every morning. Tired commuters, kids hauling heavy backpacks, people who didn't care who owned the dirt as long as it held them up. "Get Thomas on the phone," Arthur ordered, his voice tight. "Thomas manages the municipal energy grid. This is a civil engineering crisis. Thomas knows the mayor and the permit commissioners. Arthur snapped, surprised by the sharp crack of his own voice echoing off the concrete. "Tell him to meet us at the 8th Street access tunnel in 30 minutes. If he doesn't show, I'll shut down the substations feeding City Hall." The drive to the transit hub was a tense blur of flickering streetlights. Arthur drove his beat-up sedan recklessly down the empty pre-dawn avenues. Sullivan sat in the passenger seat, remarkably calm, clutching his leather portfolio. They descended into the heavy maintenance tunnel beneath Commerce Street. The vibration here was a physical entity, a bone-rattling shake every time an early train rumbled blindly overhead. The air tasted of diesel exhaust and damp, rotting earth. Thomas was waiting by the heavy iron security gate, shivering violently in a camel hair overcoat flanked by two nervous men wearing white hard hats. "Arthur!" Thomas started, his voice a defensive whine. "I don't appreciate being summoned like a stray dog." Arthur walked right past him. He unclipped his industrial flashlight and shone the powerful beam onto the massive, soot-stained concrete pylons. The bright light illuminated jagged cracks running vertically up the cement. Exposed steel rebar bled bright orange rust. Dark water seeped actively through the fissures pooling around their boots. "Look at it," Arthur said, the flashlight shaking in his exhausted grip. The two engineers stepped forward, faces draining of colour. "Christ," the older one whispered. "The lateral shear. It's actively failing. The load-bearing capacity is compromised by at least 40%. You diverted the reinforcement budget." Arthur turned slowly to Thomas, the beam catching the board member's terrified, sweating face. "To build a stadium, while the ground underneath your feet rots. I didn't. That was the zoning committee." Thomas stammered, taking a clumsy step back as the ceiling groaned audibly under the weight of an arriving train. Dust rained onto his expensive coat. "I don't care who signed the paper," Arthur said, stepping directly into Thomas's personal space. The cloying smell of sandalwood mixed sickeningly with the tunnel rot. "Release the emergency disaster funds, now. I want steel shoring columns down here by sunrise. Shut down the concourse. We can't shut down the main transit hub on a weekday. The economic impact." "Do it!" Arthur's voice dropped to a gravelly whisper. "Or I will lock the transit authority out of the power grid entirely. I will personally hand-deliver the buried engineering reports to every newspaper. You'll be in federal prison before the dust settles." Thomas swallowed hard. He nodded sharply to the engineers. "Make the calls." For the next 12 hours, Arthur didn't leave the tunnel. The noise was deafening, roaring diesel engines shouting foremen, the shriek of metal grinding concrete. He stood in ankle-deep mud. He didn't belong down here, yet he couldn't leave. A burly foreman with grease-stained coveralls handed Arthur a dented metal thermos at hour 6. Arthur drank the scalding black tea without asking what it was, grateful for the heat. He watched crews strain against heavy chains, fighting gravity to push temporary shoring columns into place. This was the real city. Blood, sweat, and rusted iron holding back disaster. By late afternoon, the steel shoring was secured. The immediate danger had passed. Arthur climbed out of the access hatch into a secluded alleyway, his thigh muscles screaming in protest. The sun was low, casting bruised purple shadows. He leaned heavily against the brick wall, coughing up construction dust, his hands trembling wildly from the adrenaline crash. Sullivan stepped out behind him meticulously, wiping soot from his glasses. "You cost the city government millions today, Arthur," the old man said softly. "I saved lives," Arthur replied, spitting grit-filled saliva onto the pavement. "Yes," Sullivan agreed, a rare ghost of a smile touching his thin lips. "You did. Elias would be absolutely furious at the sheer expense." "Good," Arthur muttered. He was a paranoid old bastard. Arthur looked up at the towering skyline. The glass towers still stood catching the dying golden light. Richard was gone. The board was terrified. The city was still broken, groaning under its own massive weight. But the foundation was his. The pipes, the wires, the deep bedrock. He was the mortar holding the crushing weight of the bricks above. He pulled the heavy ring of brass keys from his pocket, the metal warm against his palm. He had a lot of blue ink left on that map, and he was just getting started. Arthur's journey from a broken man on a gravel driveway to the underground warden of a dying metropolis proves that true power always lies hidden beneath the surface. If you love this gritty, intense dive into a hidden empire, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who appreciates a deeply grounded thriller, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more original audio dramas.